Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Reset Show. Delighted you can join us, and we've got a really good one for you today. We're joined by G, and I'm going to get this wrong. G, you have to correct me in a minute. Huijg. My pronunciation is terrible. G will tell us how to pronounce her surname. Who is fascinating background, ADHD academic, a specialist on particularly on ADHD experiences of women, and resistance to something called neuronormativity, which I think G will tell us a little bit more about in a few minutes. Postdoctoral research in this area, specialists around kind of things like neurodiversity and accessibility. So really fascinating academic experience, and we're going to learn a whole lot of terms that I've never come across before. So we're going to be talking about things like neuronormativity and neuroableism, and all will be revealed fairly shortly. So we're in for a really great 45 minutes, so thank you for joining us. But just before I hand over to B, who is going to do the introduction in a little bit more detail than I have, just wanted to remind you what the Reset Show is all about. So for those of you that are new to the Reset Show, we started this about a year ago to really understand how we could make best use of the opportunity that the pandemic has afforded us to do things differently within the world of work, and perhaps do some of those things that we've always wanted to do but not quite had the opportunity to do before. So that is really why we're here, to explore how we can improve the world of work for everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, B.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick explainer really. So G and I met last March. I think it was the very first virtual get-together I went to as the first lockdown sort of kicked in, and it was a get-together, as a virtual coffee organised by the IAF, the Institute of the International Institute of Facilitators. And G was talking about facilitating for inclusiveness, and it was a world of thinking and language that I just hadn't come across before. And we continued the conversation, and as we've continued to talk, our conversations have ranged much further than simply facilitating for inclusiveness, have included many of the things that we're going to explore today, and also include the world of succulents. So my succulents are very, very glad that G and I have met, and I've stopped overwatering them. So G, thank you so much for joining us. We've done our best at a good introduction, but before we jump into sort of the more detailed questions, is there anything about you that we haven't said that we really should have done?
Yeah, maybe it might be useful to think about that. Actually, my background is activism. So when you and I met in the facilitation, this kind of coffee meeting or coffee morning or something, it was more like a sort of, or my facilitation experience comes from activism and social movement organizing, and really just from the ground up, learning on the go in a way. And quite frankly, also my knowledge about accessibility, even though like I'm a bit more trained formally with facilitation, but accessibility is also just out of my own need and being a facilitator. So I try to be a bit more specialist, but I'm definitely not the specialist or anything, just a disclaimer.
Yeah, cool, thank you. And I love that. We've always had such broad ranging conversations, and today we've got a sort of 3 areas that we really wanted to explore with you. But we wanted to kick off with this sort of like, this concept of ADHD and living on neurodivergent terms. And obviously this is the focus of your research. So tell us a bit more about that, what it means, what drew you to it, what you're seeking to learn.
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question, and a difficult question in the sense that I'm going to start my field work actually only in September, so I haven't done the field work in a way. So it's partly a question for me too, because that's the whole idea of it. And I think what is really complicated is the question actually, like how do we know? How can one know what it means to be living on neurodivergent terms, and specifically ADHD neurodivergent terms? The reason I'm saying this is because the framework in which ADHD is being made sense of, both in academia, in community, in professional organizations, is, although from the ground up, there's like different voices coming up, but it's really like, I would say the medical model of disability is quite medicalized. It's all about fMRI scans and medication and diagnosis and symptoms and all these kind of things. Basically ADHD on medical terms, if you will, and kind of, ADHD is a burden, ADHDers as a problem, like how much money do we cost society, all these kind of things. So basically ADHDers live with a lot of stigma, grow up with like stigma, and like basically, an accumulation of perhaps, leading to trauma in a way. So like, what does it actually mean? Like, how do we discover, not just how do we know what it is, but how can we actually live on our own terms in what I would call ADHD affirmative terms, right? That really center and validate and affirm the ADHD experience. So yeah, in a way, I don't know. And just to be clear, I'm an ADHD woman myself, so I'm doing this research. I came here as an ADHD woman. So in a way, this is a question for myself, but it is definitely a research question as well. So it's quite frankly, it's an open question, and my interest in the research is really to see like how do other women do that, like how do they give shape to that and understand it.
Yeah, really interesting. So how much of your own experience are you able to bring into this research, or how much do you have to keep out? How do you manage that?
Yeah. That's a good question. And it's a question that's very alive for me, quite frankly, because, obviously, I mean, most ADHDers, they come to a diagnosis or they come to ADHD through the community rather than very often the other way around. There's ADHD support groups. There's I think there's an ADHD TikTok, there's ADHD Twitter, there's ADHD Facebook groups. There's like this whole sort of bubble of ADHD, if you will. So on the one hand, I really bring all the experience and, like I say, my own activist experience and feminist activism and social and lens and theory and intersectionality and critical race and all these kind of making sense of the world. So sort of like me looking at the world, looking at ADHD, reflecting on that, reflecting on ADHD lives and research. It comes from that. Like, it's not just ADHD, if you will. So in a way, I bring a lot. At the same time, there's this thing that I'm increasingly realizing is, when you prepare field work, you have to apply for ethics application, which is not just about ethical issues, quite frankly, but it's a shortcut. And I started to realize that actually it feels unethical if I continue to attend, for example, community groups, because it feels a little bit invasive almost. And I'm concerned that other ADHDers might think with what hat are you here? Like, in what capacity are you here? What are you doing here? So I'm really concerned about that. And also like people who might be, or like women who might be potential research participants, and like, how am I going to navigate that? So in a way, I actually been withdrawing a bit from the community, if you will. So like, it's really mixed. It's complex. I'm not really sure. It's very different from other types of research, but
yes.
What is different is that the community is much smaller. When you think about like 2.5% of the adult population in the UK are ADHDers, or are estimated to be ADHDers. We have a one-on-one gender ratio, so like 50-50 men and women.
Yeah.
The community is relatively small. I mean, if you think about the queer community, or the gay and lesbian, is also around 2.5, give or take. It's very large. So it's complex.
Yeah. So interesting. Is that, I guess that's a big consideration, to have to remove yourself, even if it's temporarily, from your communities in order to maintain the ethical standards of your research. It must be quite a price to pay, is it? Or is it feels just like the right thing to do, and that's what you'll do for now?
Yeah, I think I'm not really sure it's just for research. It just feels more ethical on a kind of large capital E, perhaps, or something. It just feels the right thing to do, I suppose. Yeah, let's see. I think with these types of questions, or things. We'll see what the prize is in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'd love to. This is a really big question, so feel free to answer it in a way that makes sense to you. Because obviously, we talk a lot about the world of work, but we talk about humans at work. So it's not just like, it's work or nothing. We talk about people at work and people's experience. So I'm really curious to understand, if it's possible, a little bit about your own experience of work as an ADHD woman. And I have to also just apologize. I don't know if you can hear the coughing in the background. I have a poorly child at home who is absolutely hacking his guts up. So I'm going to just put myself on mute to allow you to answer that question. So Dyi, the question I was sort of teeing up was just if you could share a little bit about your experience of work as an ADHD woman.
Yeah. Because you sent the questions beforehand, there's an accessibility need. So, and that was actually the question that made me think most. Because quite frankly, I think my journey is in a way not that, I mean, it's very different because all journeys are different, but most ADHD women who are diagnosed in adulthood, like me, have a complex relation to work. Yeah, and there was always this feeling like, why am I not able to find a proper job or something like that? Or a job that, is sort of in line with my interest and background and all these kind of things. And always like having this feeling of being inadequate, like doing the inappropriate things, or just not knowing how to do the things that you're supposed to do, or like as if there's this mismatch and like, I don't know, like a misunderstanding. Why is this not functioning really like how it should function? Yes, and this was till I actually started my PhD. People think that I had a career. I had really no career proper before I started my PhD, frankly. And I really don't want to return to that. So yeah, it's difficult again when you think about living on your own neurodivergent ADHD terms. Like, it's difficult to make sense of that, and it's looking back, it's trying to reframe how much of that was, if you will, neuroableism, right? Ableism against neurodivergent folks, or anti-ADHD ableism, sort of not being able to live up to like these neurotypical, neuronormative norms. And not being aware of it as well. Like, there's that too, right? On the other hand, like when I did my PhD, which took a long time because I'm multiply disabled, not just ADHD. Yeah, it was also lovely that in the teaching, there's mostly how I earn my money next to that scholarship. There's a lot of freedom and there's a lot of quality and skill they can put in. And there's this, like, slowly I started to develop, and this is where facilitation actually comes in, the sensitivity of being disabled myself, like in a broader sense, and having access needs, and like how because I've always been interested in facilitation, coming from activism, right? And yes, a lot of teaching is about facilitation. How can I make, how can I change that, if you will, and slowly thinking about, oh wait, this is not just about accessibility of the students, this is about my accessibility, right? And if my access needs become more important, I think very often the idea is that accessibility impacts other people negatively. But what about if accessibility of, in this case, a seminar leader or teaching assistant or lecturer, at some point I was a lecturer, what if that actually benefits students? What if we actually can change a different classroom? And, at some point I start to think about, what does it mean to be an ADHD, or what does it mean to be neurodivergent? What does it mean to teach in a neurodivergent, affirmative or positive way, right? That benefits everyone for a variety of reasons, disabled folks, neurodivergent folks, but also people who are marginalized for other reasons, right? So it became a way more constructive and positive experience. And this is where this idea of relaxed pedagogy came about. And trying, really being able to experiment, is quite lovely, actually. So it's I hadn't actually thought about it like this. It's the first time. Thank you for asking the question. And even this, what happens now, like, because in the meanwhile, I was talking, I already forgot what you asked various times. And, like, I run 2 reading groups.
Yes.
I can talk about it in a second. And it's really interesting what creating new norms does.
Yes.
And like one of these norms and like neuronorms, if you will, ADHD and autism, dyslexia, like affirmative norms. So what does it mean if I'm teaching and in the middle I say, I have no clue what I was talking about? What was my question? Can anybody help me? And not be ashamed of it, or just be with that vulnerability and sort of see it as a collective experience in which everybody needs to contribute or is invited to contribute, and really welcome when someone tells what the question was, or just go like, oh, okay, I don't know, or like, yeah. Anyway,
I suppose your experience is so rich in terms of its ability to make things clearer to people who aren't experiencing the world or the world of work in the way that you are, because the nature of your work, whether it's teaching or facilitating, is all part of the people process. So actually bringing your experience and sharing that and making the experience okay for you as well as for everybody else is part of the richness of the people process that others can learn from. So it's not something that, if you're doing any other number of other jobs, that your specific access needs, whatever, may just become a little bit invisible to people, maybe.
Yeah, and actually, yeah, that's a good point, and it's part of ableism, isn't it? Like, we should feel shame. We don't want to. Partially, it's good, but we don't want to point out that someone has access needs.
Yes.
Like sort of like that, but also, in a way, part of the question. I already forgot what you asked. Let me just.
It was more of a sort of a statement, or a rambling statement than a question.
It's like, what was my thought now? Where's it gone? Sorry, my thoughts are sort of physical. They just go somewhere, and then I have to sort of like find them. All right. Well, there we go. This is neurodivergent participation live.
It's great. I'm going to ask you another question, then I'm just going to tee up to Emma. That Emma, I know that you're going to have lots of questions to ask as well. So, Dyi, I've got another question for you. This might be a really unfair question, but for people of us like me who are really new to this world, some of these terms are like, I've got a good stab at what they mean, but I might be a bit off target with my definition. So terms like neuroableism and neuronormativity, are you able to give us a sort of a layman's explanation of what those terms mean? Is that a really unfair question?
Well, no, it's not an unfair. It's a very fair question, because nobody uses the terms. Like, I think neuroableism, I just started to use it. Neuronormative has been used by others, but part of my background is critical whiteness studies. So, you have like white normativity, heteronormativity. So I don't use it very significantly, in a very significant different way. Neuroableism, I just see it as a part of ableism at large, and it's just a specific type of ableism. Yeah. So it's but yeah, I think so. But this is probably not very useful. I think my response is a bit academic, because I actually wanted to say, yeah, it's all up to us. What do we think? We have to, but it's not very useful. So yeah, like ableism, I think, when we think about racism, for example, it's really problematic, or sexism, to think of it only as in one-on-one interactions, right? Or just a thing that one person does. So it's more about seeing the world as a system that is organized, is really grounded, like permeated, but really organized. All the structures are sort of organized by ableism and like centering abledness, able-mindedness, cognitive ableism, mental ableism, physical ableism, all these kind of things, and norms. But also discrimination, marginalizing structures, all these kind of things. And neuronormativity, I have to admit, I'm moving a little bit away from these terms, but I think it's really about, thinking about white normativity and heteronormativity. So like, what kind of norms are there in society that center neurotypicality, like norms around neuroness. I don't know. I just invent this word. I don't know. It's probably not a word, but that everyone else has to sort of not just abide by, but we really have to internalize them and make them our own. And that is what is good. That is what we need to aspire. That is how we have to see ourselves. This is how we have to assess ourselves against, right? Like autistic folks, for example, talk about masking, right? And so like you learn to mask, specifically autistic girls and women, you learn to mask, and it's like, a lifetime of unmasking. But I think a lot of ADHDers do this as well. Like, to give an example, in academia, if this would have been an academic conference and I stopped talking halfway and the topic wouldn't be ADHD, right, or neurodivergence, and I'm like, yeah, I don't know what I was talking about, then people would sort of look at me like, oh, you're not reliable, you're not intelligent, you're not smart, there's something wrong with you. We're not going to cite you, we're not going to give you a job, go on and further. And then there's all these, ways how racism and sexism and classism operate.
Yes.
Yeah. But you can even think about it further. You can even like say, for example, how is racism actually grounded partially in ableism, neuroableism, madness, or ideas around that, right? Like how do they function through each other? Like, for example, very often, like Black and brown folks are seen as mad or seen as crazy, right? Whether this is true or not true is sort of irrelevant, or that's how race or prejudice functions.
Yes.
Or whiteness is very often about rationality. And rationality is immediately already linked to neuroableism and ableism, right?
Yeah.
Or linearity. It's so neurotypical. Like you have to start at the start of a story, an introduction, then you have to give your argument, then the end. And ADHDers, they go like very often like that. And then at some point, somewhere it ends or it just stops.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I know, Emma, and I was going to come to you. I know there will be lots coming up for you in terms of thoughts and questions.
Oh, cool. Thanks, B. Yeah, really, really interesting conversation. What I'd love to get into is, so what can we do in the world of work? What can we do to make the world of work more inclusive, not just for people with ADHD, but for people who may be neurodiverse in other ways? What are the practical things we can start to do? So you talked about social norms, for example, starting to change the social norms, but have you got any other thoughts in terms of what we can practically do to, to be more inclusive?
Yeah, no, actually. I'm very not a practical person in that sense, and I'm a little bit more leaning towards revolution and the system needs to change and all these kind of things, and you have to follow these steps, and it's not really my take on things. But just to be clear, steps are really important and urgent, and without all these steps, my life would have been worse, and with more steps, my life is better, and so are others. But since that's not really my activist or academic orientation, I'm gonna move it a little bit back and just say, I think everybody has to start with the question: how am I a problem? How is what I do a problem, to others, like in an individual, interpersonal, structural, systemic level? And I think that's quite frankly the best question. And not get, like we all are a problem, like all the time for others, right? Or what we do is problematic, or quite frankly, almost nobody is exempt from that reality. So just think about like, how is my life and the way that I function and my company functions and relations, and how are meetings organized? How are these actually expressions, from neuronormativity, like norms and habits and practices that just have been constructed over centuries here in the UK, really. And educate yourself. Do you know what I mean? Like it's and try things out. Because I think the good thing about realizing is that we are all a problem one way or another at some point or another is, well, if we try things, the worst that we can achieve is we don't achieve anything. And the best is that we do achieve something, or we do it wrong and we learn something, right? So I think trying things out and yeah, not seeing things as a checklist really, but like, you know, in facilitation, it's all relational, and it's all about what's in the moment, what's there, and that's where we start with. That's what we're with, and that's what we can change, right? When you facilitate a group, you have to know who's in the room and what's in the room and where is everyone in the room, literally, but also kind of in other levels. And that's where you start. And like, yeah, like what is in the room that we don't see, like, and quite frankly, willingness. Like, because if you're not really willing to stop forcing people coming to meetings, there's really no point to making any changes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I love the challenge of, you know, the problem starts with all of us, and educate yourself. I think it's a great place to start. I suppose I'm just reflecting, thinking out loud, because my husband is ADHD, and you know, he did work for a while in the corporate world, but then when he was able to get out, his answer was always like, I'd rather stick pencils in my eyes than go back into work in the corporate world. So I'm just I don't know, I'm thinking out loud here, right? And I'm wondering if there are some good stories, good examples of where the corporate world is able to make changes to welcome people with different needs, such as ADHD or whether it's Asperger's, whatever it might be from a neurodiversity point of view. Or if you just go, you know what, that's just, if you're you know, whatever your needs are, that environment's just probably not going to work for you. And I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just kind of reflecting on that. I would love to hear from other people about that. I think it's not just work, it's education as well. Education is not set up for people that have any kind of neurodiversity either. That's a whole other research show. Yeah, it'd be great to hear from the people around, you know, what we can do in the world of work to make it more inclusive. And I think one of my barriers I've always found, I mean, I've been working in, it's not my area expertise, but I first worked in the field of diversity and inclusion back in the 90s, and I worked for a big utility company, and I got to work on the diversity strategy, and I was completely new to it and I had no idea what I was doing. And one of my big aha moments was, I'm so frightened of offending people and upsetting people, because I so desperately want to say and do the right thing, which is a whole therapist dream right there, that I will kind of step back and say nothing at all. So what help can you give us, neurotypical? It's my husband's term, he calls me a neurotypical. What can we do to have more of an open, constructive conversation around these sorts of topics? What works? How do we get better at talking about this stuff? Get curious about it.
Sorry, I'm just kindly going to ask everyone in the room who's not talking to mute themselves, if that's all right. Okay, so this is one way to talk about it, is to just ask, and know that you might get a negative response, and in a way that's for everyone, isn't it? So I think it's about, quite frankly, listening. Listening and not having an idealized sense. It's something that I've been thinking about lately a lot, is I think there's a kind of idealized idea around perfectionist and quite normative idea around what does it mean to support others, or to generate accessibility, or contribute to accessibility, or accessibilize, let's call it that. And, you know, as if it's something that you want to do or are happy to do. Quite frankly, my sort of point of departure is grumpiness. I don't like change that much, unless I'm the one generating it. So I get slightly grumpy. Oh, I have to do something for someone else. Oh, I don't want to think about that. Oh, this is how I do it, right? That is my internal response. And I'm sharing that to what is the word? To sort of like move away from this pedestal of charity work, almost, if you will, right? So I think it's really about listening and listening to yourself, and just be realistic about what your response is and what your lack of knowledge is, and even acknowledging that you just don't know, right? And to just start somewhere. Sorry, like sorry, let me just pop this out. Give me one section. Because like in response to your first question, because I was still a bit stuck with the corporate, like I worked in banking, if you believe it or not, but and I have some positive and some negative experiences, but some work, there were parts I was really quite good at, quite frankly, because it had a kind of an environment or a pace, like really quick, and deadlines, and a lot of variety, a lot of out of the box independence, all these kind of things. It really fit me. Like I also worked in a supermarket, or not a supermarket, like how do you call this? A department, like anyway, something similar, and it just bored my brain out. It was terrible. Like it was shatter, like made my mind collapse. So yeah, definitely not very fit for that. Not everybody's fit for every type of job, and I think that's fine. But the point is, we only know that if we try to make it fit for people who want to work that and who do have capacities and skills and background and aspirations and all these kind of things, right? I mean, the really annoying, quite frankly, in my perspective, examples are that, secret services are really eager for some Asperger's, probably white male Asperger's folk or Asperger's folk, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Not really. I'll be really honest. I'm not really a fan of the policing state. Like in the entertainment industry, for example, in the arts, there are a lot of ADHDers, as far as I think. Now, I'm sociology writing. We're supposed to write really long, or that's what I do, pieces of academic writing, and I'm a postdoctoral level. That's not super accessible. That's not a very common pathway for an ADHDer. So, but there are parts I'm really good at. So it's a very gray area, and most of it is kind of the point of departure is not you're not fit here, but we are likely not completely fit for you. So how can we change? And where can we start this change? And thinking through, well, maybe you need neurodivergent folks for this, to really think through things very methodically and really see the whole box and what is outside the box. And because we see things that other folks might not see. So there you go, you need us. And then, and just like every day is a new day, and every day is a moment for change, really. Like it's, yeah, like I say, I'm not very practical, and kind of, it's not really where I want to go. But
no, it's interesting. I think that's a really good point. How do we help companies get much better at understanding the strengths? I mean, we talk about the strengths that come from having a diverse workforce. That's a given, but I think a layer above that or below that, whichever way you want to go, is that the strengths that different elements of neurodiversity bring, exactly the point you just made around, people like Asperger's are often very intuitive. I'm not going to generalize here.
Yeah.
I think companies, in my experience, aren't good at spotting that or going, hang on a minute, you'd be great at this. It's a kind of a very one-size-fits-all approach to recruitment often, and maybe a few psychometrics thrown in for good measure, but they're not that useful in many cases.
I on the one hand, I agree with you, because we all should, in any company or organization, should have an approach to what strengths do you have, or what strengths can you develop, what skills, what qualities, capacities are there to, grow. I'm very reluctant to talk about strengths, that neurodivergent have strengths, for two reasons. One is it's part of the burden deficit model. Yeah. Like, oh, we're deficient, we're a problem, we're a burden. But hey, we have strengths, so you can use us, and you can capitalize and monetize and all these kind of things, all right? But it also assumes that neurotypicality is strength, right? And that really is it? That's a good question. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, again, I think you get into such an interesting discussion around this. I'm going to hand back over to B in one sec for the comments, because you've got some great comments coming through. I have this discussion with my husband and my son often, who are both Asperger's, and my son certainly sees his Asperger's as superpower, and he gets, but my husband doesn't. So even within our family, there's kind of opposing views. So it's a really good debate to have. On that note, Bea, I'm going to hand back over to you for some of the comments and to carry on the questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry if I go on mute or just jump off just because somebody's decided to start digging up the road, almost exactly to coincide with the beginning of our conversation. So that was amazing timing. But it's so fascinating. The conversation in the chat is almost entirely in parallel to the conversation that we're having as well. So similar points coming up about, you know, celebrating strengths in different forms of neuros, and, you know, so for everything from dyslexia to this idea of the language around, again, the language of, is that we should get away from the language of overcoming difference and recognizing, you know, what it does bring to the table. So it's sort of similar track of conversation there as well. But your points, G, about, you know, whether that is a useful approach or not, again, so much more that we could discuss here, and probably no one definitive answer on that. I just wanted to turn quickly to what some of your things that you're doing alongside your research project at the moment. And I know that you run this intersectional neurodiversity reading group and an intersectional disability reading group, and that you facilitate those. And you talked a lot about sort of almost, you know, learning to facilitate for accessibility as you've gone along. So not claiming to be an expert, but the things that you've learned. So my question would be, you know, what have you learned from that experience of facilitating these two reading groups?
I think that well, I think the most important thing I would say is that we don't really know. When I say we, that really includes disability environment, is like, what does neurodivergence, affirmative facilitation looks like? How does that function? Because a lot around accessibility, it's around disability really, in a physical sense very often, or vision or hearing impairments, and I happen to have fluctuatingly both to some extent. Yeah, I had another thought, but that's gone. So actually the most important thing, what I learned, is how relaxed it is to facilitate those reading groups in comparison to facilitate where the majority often is neurodivergent and or disabled, in comparison to having to go back to the abled neurotypical worlds and facilitate there, and having all these barriers and other norms that and it's interesting because you actually started with the pandemic, and, you know, ending up with a lot of neurodivergent folks around me, and having all these Zoom contacts, quite frankly, forgetting almost about other norms. Like, I think there has been for me personally, a sort of, not unpacking, but, you know, like you forget things. I don't know if you've had this. It's with any stuff. Let me give another example. When I'm on the road, sometimes I start to walk on the wrong side again. Like, I come from the Netherlands, the right side. But, you know, like, because like traffic, you know, idea of traffic goes back to where it was a long time ago or something like that. But there's also this, like, there have been new norms have been created. And like, for example, if I'm here, not in a neurodivergent environment, no offense, and all of a sudden I forget something, I feel myself tense up and I'm like, oh, I shouldn't do this, right? Oh, I shouldn't look around. And when I facilitate those environments, for me as a facilitator, it's more relaxed, and it's more relaxed for others. And it just, how it can become like, not just a jacket that you put on, but like ingrained that there are multiple ways that you can participate and contribute and validate it, or be critical or not, and know and don't know, and all these kind of things, and be nonlinear. it feels really existential. I feel like I'm going really deep, but that's what it feels like a little bit. And then there's like all these practical things about facilitation itself. I'm happy to talk about that as well.
Yes, please do. Yeah, I mean, practical tips around facilitating for inclusiveness would be really useful. I know that we've touched on some in our conversations we've had. So those practical tips would be great.
Like, for example, everyone being on mute who's not talking, right? Because definitely like the Zoom environments, and for me being around in quiet, but for others, I hear this from so many people, it's everything is like becomes a sensory overload and becomes really difficult to concentrate, right? So things like that, using the raised hand method like that, right? Instead, because like turn taking is really complex for a lot of people. So, that is one of the things that we use. For example, we actually turn off the chat box so people can chat, like they can send a message to me, but not the chat box at large, because it interferes with screen readers. But it also really impacts neurodivergent folks because like even you saw it with me, like I just get distracted. And I can't multitask in that sense, like that's really difficult. So it becomes like a conversation, interaction sort of on the side that I can't really do. So yeah, like these are the things that make things more accessible. But also, for example, as long as I know as a coordinator who's everyone in the room, people have to introduce themselves so that everybody else knows who's in the room, because folks who are vision impaired, for example, they don't know how many people there are. So there's sort of like verbal guideposting, if you will, as well. So people have to introduce themselves, but they can have the camera off. We have a listening only list now that developed. So at the start, I write down names, and I'm not going to cold call on anyone. It's also something that I started actually in teaching. And people can still contribute, obviously, but there's not this like enforcing that you have to vocalize, you have to do that. And also that people can, write whatever it is that they want to say to me in the chat. And then I say, oh, this is G for that person. Is actually my previous co-organizer of the disability reading group, Kelsey Acton, who sort of suggested that. So either because someone doesn't speak vocally, but they write, so that's the way that they contribute, or maybe they're anxious or whatever. So they can contribute in writing, for example. Another thing is that, and this started with a screen reader, like folks vision impaired, who first of all don't necessarily know who's in the room, right? So I say how many people there are at the start, like people introduce themselves very briefly. But also when people start talking, they say, this is, and then they say their name. And when they finish talking, they say end of speech or end of thought or end of talk or whatever it is. And that way, other people know that they might be able to start talking. So it helps to know for the person who cannot visually sort of experience who is talking, they know who is talking, definitely when it's new voices, right? But it also helps for neurodivergent folks for the like turn taking, like you don't want to, but interestingly, it brought something else. And I think that is a kind of really dynamic, organic way of, developing a more neurodiversifying facilitation is that I realized that if you say end of talk or end of thought, that was the initial term, it was a really neurotypical norm, because maybe your thought is not ended, but your speech is ending because you don't know where your thought is going, or you don't know where your thought was. So why not leave that and just be very practical and realistic about what is happening? Maybe you stopped talking and that was it. And then there's other things like always trying to support. For example, there might be people who find talking too long or like don't want to dominate, because it's really important that accessibility is intersectional, like not just white people talking, not just men folks or cis folks talking, all these kind of things, or neurotypical people talking. So like, how can I help you, to be facilitated or something like that? Like, how can we have conversations around this? So it's kind of like trying to be interactive around that as well.
There's so many great tips there, and just things that just weren't on my radar at all. And I've been learning about and talking about and actively facilitating for years. So it's quite shocking that some of this stuff is so new and so rich. So thank you so much for sharing. I've got one last question for you. I know that you've got a really interesting event, a webinar on disability and race that's just coming up, and this is a flipped webinar. I've just had a look at what to expect from that, and it just looks brilliant. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So again, the flip webinar is, again, to make it more accessible, both for disabled and neurodivergent folks, but also for non-academics or students. So it consists of blog posts that are go online actually tomorrow, like a week or more before the event itself. And then there is the event itself. And in our case, we decided to not have presentations. So people are expected in a way to read the blog post beforehand. It will just a brief summary of like 75 words. And then it's like 25-minute Q&A basically. And the audience can submit questions till the 7th of July. They will be sent to the contributors, the panelists. And again, this is also so everybody feels prepared and, and doesn't feel like sort of overwhelmed. So in terms of the program, I can pop the link in the chat just in case. Oops. Oh, that's wrong. Sorry, I'm doing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for the listeners, we'll make sure that we include it. If you've subscribed to the podcast, we'll make sure that we add the link to that in the follow-up email as well. So thank you.
So the blog posts go live tomorrow, and the actual webinar is on July the...
Yeah, Friday in a week, 9th in the afternoon. Like 4 panels start on the hour. And there's, for example, like a whole panel on ADHD and race. The program is changing a little bit, so I can't say too much because it goes live tomorrow. I'm having it in front of me. Historical reflections of social movement, policing, education, non-recognition of racialized disability, research, co-production, reflexivity. I'm really excited about it.
It's just amazing. I just got really drawn in when I just went in to have a look at the descriptions of what to expect, got really drawn in and thought, wow, you could definitely spend a very good quality afternoon discussing these amazing topics, many of which were very, very new to me. So I wish you all the best with that. I will finish. I'll come back to Emma in just a moment, but I just wanted to finish you just to say thank you so much for joining you, and I've loved getting to know you over the last few months and exploring, as I say, so many new areas for me. So it's been brilliant having you on. So big thank you from me. Emma.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed it as well. Yeah,
massive thank you, G, for coming on and educating us all. I say it's a huge topic and something that I think we just are beginning to learn a lot more about from our point, from my point. I won't speak for everyone else, from my point of view. So thank you for that. And I'll definitely be checking out your webinar because that looks fascinating. And just before we finish, so massive thank you to G, huge thank you to Belinda for co-hosting duties. Justin's on a little sabbatical this week, and as always, big thank you to Katie for doing the production in the background. So next time on the Reset Show, it's the 14th of July is our next one. And we're going to be talking about HR versus racism. So just a small topic there for us to get our teeth into. It should be a really good one. We're really looking forward to this. We've got Nicole Desar, Onika Cornelius and Kendra Jackson coming on to talk about this topic, enlighten us. And again, I know that I'm going to be learning loads on there. So come along, 14th of July. As always, share the podcast, like it if you can. Any reviews would be great. And we hope to speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye.